ओम परतत्वे सदा लीनो रामकृष्ण समाज्ञया यो धर्म स्थापन रतो वीरेशम तम नमाम्यहम. We are studying here Swami Vivekananda's Jnana Yoga, and in that the New York lectures we are studying, and first two lectures are on cosmos, out of which the first lecture we have studied last time, that was cosmos, the macrocosm. And now we have to study the cosmos, microcosm. And we saw the meaning last time, that cosmos is same as universe. But when you look at universe as a regulated, systematic some unit, then we call it cosmos. And within that cosmos, macrocosm means something big of which the smallers are part. And the microcosm means that smaller part of the bigger part. Now, according to the original Sanskrit Shastric terminology, Samashti, cosmos, Brahmanda, macrocosm. Samashti, cosmos, Vyashti or Pinda is microcosm. And Swamiji has in the previous lecture told us that what is here is there. Whatever is in Pinda is in Brahmanda. But the study is different. In the first lecture of Jnana Yoga which we studied, the English lectures, London lectures, called the necessity of religion, Swamiji had shown that two origins of religion. One is studying the external powers of nature and making them deified or seeing them as divinities, devatas. And finally come to the conclusion that there is only one devata. The other side was seeing what is real in this body. When it dies, what remains? And when we come to the reality of individuals, we come to the same reality of the universal. So, search is inside. From inside, we are going to reach the same reality. That we have to study today. Exactly 1 week after the previous lecture, delivered in New York, 26th January 1896. And why that was studied first? The human mind naturally wants to get outside, to peer out of the body, as it were, through the channels of the organs. In the Kathopanishad it is said that Paramatma, Swayambhu Paramatma, injured our bodies by punching holes opening outside. So, channels of the organs, and from there we look outside. So we try to get out of ourselves from the indriyas. The eye must see. So that is the property or the power of the organs. If eye is there, it must see. In the Mandukya Upanishad it is explained that man has to feed 19 mouths every day, not only one mouth. The Pancha Pranas, Pancha Karmendriyas, Pancha Jnanendriyas, and the 4 inner organs. He must provide food to them continuously. So, eyes are there, we must see. The ear must hear. The senses must sense the external world. And naturally, the beauties and sublimities of nature captivate the attention of man first. So in the last lecture you have seen, beauty is that which produces joy and we try to enjoy. Sublimity also produces joy, but it sends our minds in the higher regions and we want to study it further to know its source. So the beauties and sublimities of nature captivated the attention of man first. The first question that arose in the human soul were about the external world. The solution of the mystery was asked of the sky, of the stars, of the heavenly bodies, of the earth, of the rivers, of the mountains, of the oceans, and in all ancient religions we find traces of how the groping human mind at first caught at everything external. Mind is groping. Through the Indriyas it caught the external world and asked questions. There was a river god, Devata Jnana, a sky god, a cloud god, a rain god, everything external, all of which we now call the powers of nature, became metamorphosed, that means totally transformed, transfigured into wheels. So they have individuality of their own, into gods, into heavenly messengers. So sometimes in the Christian religion they are called angels. So heavenly messengers. As the question went deeper and deeper, these external manifestations failed to satisfy the human mind and finally the energy turned inwards. So here the solution we got was the personal God, but the mind was not satisfied. We have seen in many lectures that all the problems of life, all the questions of life are not solved there. Why there is evil and all that. So the man turned inside. Failing to get a solution from outside, man turned inside. And this is a higher step of evolution. And the question was asked of the man's own soul. So he started searching here. From the macrocosm, the question was reflected back to the microcosm. What is happening? You are all getting my lecture, I hope. Yes. From the external world, the question was reflected to the internal. From analyzing the external nature, man is led to analyze the internal. This questioning of the internal man comes with a higher state of civilization, with a deeper insight into nature, with a higher state of growth. So it's a question of evolution. The subject of discussion this afternoon is this internal man. No question is so near and dear to man's heart as that of the internal man, because we are very near ourselves. So that question also is very near and dear to man. How many millions of times, in how many countries has this question been asked? So that we have seen that everybody in the course of evolution asks about himself. Sages and kings, rich and poor, saints and sinners, every man, every woman, all have from time to time asked this question. So a time comes in life when we ask what we are. Is there nothing permanent in this evanescent human life? So everything we know of life, body, organs, mind, they are evanescent. But is something permanent there? Is there nothing, they have asked, which does not die away when this body dies? Is there not something living when this frame crumbles into dust? Is there not something which survives the fire, which burns the body into ashes? So this is all that Kathopanishad question of the death. And if so, what is its destiny? Where does it go? Where does it go? Whence did it come? Then the question comes, from where it arose. These questions have been asked again and again, and so long as this creation lasts, so long as there are human brains to think, this question will have to be asked. That means every person will have to find his own answer. Yet, it is not that the answer did not come. Each time the answer came. And as time rolls on, the answer will gain strength more and more. The question was answered once for all. Thousands of years ago, that is during the Upanishads. And through all subsequent time, it is being restated, re-illustrated, that means examples, made clearer to our intellect. What we have to do, therefore, is to make a restatement of the answer. Very important from Swamiji's thought point of view. What Swamiji's work point of view. What Swamiji is doing. We do not pretend to throw any new light on those all-absorbing problems. Please all who think that Swami Vivekananda is a new philosophy, please listen. Swamiji himself is telling he has nothing new to tell you. Nothing new to tell you. Swamiji is categorically stating, you cannot make it new. We cannot make Swamiji's things new. But only to put before you the ancient truth in the language of the modern times. So man's way of thinking changes. So the language changes. It is not question of Sanskrit or English, but the process of thinking, expressing was different. Truth cannot change. To speak the thoughts of the ancients in the language of the moderns, to speak the thoughts of the philosophers in the language of the people. What Shankar has told, that Swamiji wants to tell in a common language. To speak the thoughts of the angels in the language of man. Here the rishis are called angels. To speak the thoughts of God in the language of poor humanity. The Vedas is supposed to be the expression of God, and we are human beings. So, Swamiji has to tell it in this language, so that man will understand them. For the same divine essence from which the ideas emanated is ever present in man. Vedanta itself tells us that there is only one reality. So from the reality, if the expression has come, that very reality is in man. So he will understand if put in proper language of our own times, of Swamiji's own times. And therefore he can always understand them. Now, one general misunderstanding or whatever you call it, I will present to you. Other side of it, especially in South India. I was asked several times, has Swamiji said something new? The line of argument is, if it is not in the Vedas, it is wrong. And if it is not something new, what has he done? You know the answer? I asked them, what new has Shankaracharya told which is not in the Vedas? If he has told something not in the Vedas, throw it away. And if he has told same thing in the Vedas, what he has told? Swamiji has made it very clear here. Shankara's time was the philosopher's time. And historically, I have told you several times that Kumaril Bhatta's one background was Buddhism. Then came Kumaril Bhatta. And he proved the Vedas stronger the Karma Kanda part of the Vedas. So these were the two common backgrounds for Shankaracharya, common Purva Pakshas. And so we see in Shankar Bhashya repeated criticism of the Karma Kanda. Criticism means it is not fulfill life, Gyan will fulfill life. Why Shankar is telling again and again? This can be historically viewed, because before him, the Kumaril Bhatta's ideas had flooded India, because man got back his faith in the Vedas, but the Karma Kanda portion. And so Shankar has to tell their faults and he has to tell new things. Now, Vedanta became intellectual by Shankar's emphasis. Vedanta became too much on Nirguna Brahma side because Shankar's emphasis. That is Swamiji's background. That is my background. So I have to tell you again and again, this theoretical Vedanta is the Purva Paksha, who think if intellectually we understand Vedanta, we have gained everything. And quoting from Shankar's Viveka Chodamani, I have replied to that recently. Always. Vivek Chodamani Shankar says, unless you have Aparoksha Anubhava, the word Brahman will not help you. And there I told, when Udasi Baba's commentary, he quotes from some ancient scripture and he says it is like there is a mango tree and the fruit is on the top of the tree. And below the mango tree there is a pond in which the fruits are reflected. You look at them and congratulate yourself that you have eaten the mango by seeing the reflection in the pond. That is, he says, for all those who intellectually believe that they understood Vedanta, they have realized. And even today, there are people like that. So, emphasis is the cause of this. And our supremely revered Holy Mother, repeatedly I am telling you that, she said that the olden Mahapurushas emphasized some aspects of the spiritual experience. The other aspects became suppressed. This time it has not happened so. Sri Ramakrishna has not emphasized any particular aspect. He has emphasized every aspect. Especially coming to this point, he has said again and again, sometimes I stay in the transcendent, sometimes in the immanent. I stay in the Nitya, I stay in the Leela. So equal emphasis he has given to transcendental nature of the self and to the immanent nature of the self. Other than this, no change. And that Swamiji representing Sri Ramakrishna has brought before us always. Now, recently reading Chandogya Upanishad, I found Shankara repeatedly telling that the aim of life is sarvatmata, to become identified with the entire universe. And it takes it as a natural corollary of the transcendent reality. But overall in his literature we find emphasis towards the transcendent. That's all. Whenever the occasion has demanded, he has clearly said that transcendental self itself is immanent. So this is what Swamiji has stated in the beginning. If you use the olden language, it becomes useless. I heard recently people from the traditional ashramas asking people to follow the old karma kandas. Does any man follow these days? Can any man follow? Swamiji has explained that also. That the karma and its results are always in the field of Maya. They will have to change and they are changing. So, Swamiji has very clearly stated this in the beginning of this lecture. In the last lecture also Swamiji had said this in one sentence, that I am not telling something new, I am presenting before you the ideas of the old people. Here he has more categorically stated his own work. Now he starts the analysis. After this background, his own position, now he starts the analysis of the individual. I am looking at you. How many things are necessary for this vision? First, the eyes. For if I am perfect in every other way and yet have no eyes, I shall not be able to see you. Secondly, the real organ of vision. That means eyes, the socket. And the real organ of vision is in the modern language, brain center. It is the capacity to see that functions through this aperture. So that Swamiji calls as the second. Secondly, the real organ of vision, for the eyes are not the organs, they are but the instruments of vision, and behind them is the real organ, the nerve center in the brain. If that center be injured, a man may have the clearest pair of eyes, yet he will not be able to see anything. So it is necessary that the center or the real organ be there. Thus, with all our senses. So eyes, like that, all our senses, these are the sockets, and the real organ is working through them. The external ear is but the instrument for carrying the vibrations of sound inward to the center. Yet that is not sufficient. Suppose in your library you are intently reading a book and the clock strikes, yet you do not hear it. The sound is there, the pulsations in the air are there, the ear and the center are also there, and these vibrations have been carried through the ear to the center, and yet you do not hear it. What is wanting? The mind is not there. Thus we say that the third thing necessary is that the mind must be there. First the external instruments, then the organs to which the external instruments will carry the sensation, and lastly the organ itself must be joined to the mind. When the mind is not joined to the organ and the ear may take the impression, and yet we shall not be conscious of it. The mind too is only the carrier. It has to carry the sensation still forward and present it to the intellect, actually the consciousness behind. And in Swamiji's days, it was called the intellect. Now the equivalent is buddhi. And in the scripture, this buddhi word occurs, and we are all confused. We take that buddhi to be the rational process of intelligence, which is in the mind itself. Buddhi means bodha, I consciousness. That has to be behind the mind. The intellect is the determining faculty and decides upon what is brought to it. Still, this is not sufficient. The intellect must carry it forward and present the whole thing before the ruler in the body, the human soul. So, the role of intellect, if it is taken physically, then it determines and presents to the soul. I repeatedly told you they are overlapping. The king on the throne, before him this is presented, and then from him comes the order. This is the sensory nerves, and through the motory nerves, the order is carried out. What to do or what not to do. And the order goes down in the same sequence to the intellect, to the mind, to the organs of action. And the organs convey it to the instruments, and the perception is complete. So when the full thing happens, then the reaction, then the perception is complete. The instruments are in the external body, the gross body of man, but the mind and the intellect are not in the gross body. There are subtle things, means we do not see them, means yogis see them. They are in what is called in Hindu philosophy the finer body, and what in Christian theology you read of it as the spiritual body of man. Finer, very much finer than the body, and yet not the soul. The soul is beyond them all. The external body perishes in a few years. Any simple cause may disturb and destroy it. The finer body is not so easily perishable, yet it sometimes degenerates and at other times becomes strong. We see how in the old man the mind loses its strength, how when the body is vigorous, the mind becomes vigorous, how various medicines and drugs affect it, how everything external acts on it, and how it reacts on the external world. So, mind, changing. Just as the body has its progress and decadence, so also is the mind, and therefore the mind is not the soul, because the soul can neither decay nor degenerate. Something fixed has to be there. How can we know that? No, Swamiji is proving this. How can we know that there is something behind this mind? Because knowledge which is self-illuminating and the basis of intelligence cannot belong to dull, dead matter. So, this is the great thing, to understand the difference between consciousness and intellect if it is matter. Matter cannot know anything. It may make a form and present and all that, but the knowledge is consciousness. And so, consciousness is necessary. Never was seen any gross matter which has intelligence at its own essence. That no dull or dead matter can illumine itself. It is intelligence that illumines all matter. This hall is here only through intelligence, because as a hall its existence would be unknown unless some intelligence built it. So, in making also hall, consciousness is necessary, and in perceiving the hall also consciousness is necessary. This body is not self-luminous. If it were, it would be so in a dead man also. Neither can the mind nor the spiritual body be self-luminous. They are not of the essence of intelligence. Essence of intelligence is consciousness. That which is self-luminous cannot decay, because it is not matter. The luminosity of that which shines through a borrowed light comes and goes, but that which is light itself, what can make that come and go? So this ego or I is a reflection. The original consciousness is constant. We see that the moon waxes and wanes because it shines through the borrowed light of the sun. So on what part of the moon the light is falling and what part we are seeing, according to that the waxing and waning goes on. If a lump of iron is put into the fire and made red hot, it glows and shines, but its light will vanish because it is borrowed. So decadence is possible only of the light which is borrowed and is not of its own essence. Clear arguments are very plain and simple if we follow them. Now we say that the body, the external shape, has no light as its own essence, is not self-luminous and cannot know itself, neither can the mind. Why not? Because the mind waxes and wanes. So, changing thing cannot be luminous. Because it is vigorous at one time and weak at another, because it can be acted upon by anything and everything. Therefore, the light which shines through the mind is not its own. Whose is it then? It must belong to that which has it as its own essence, and as such can never decay or die, never become stronger or weaker. It is self-luminous, it is luminosity itself. It cannot be that the soul knows, but it is knowledge. That means soul knows means split of subject and object, and that is the individual I consciousness. But this is universal. It cannot be that the soul has existence, but it is existence. These are important points. If soul is existing, I can see the soul. But I exist, you exist, the pencil exists, the table exists. This existence is the nature of the soul. I know, you know, he, she, it knows. This essence of knowledge is Brahman. It cannot be that the soul is happy, it is happiness itself. Satchit Anandam. I am happy means I am different, happiness is different, it is in me. And I am happiness, that means that is my very essence. Very quickly Swamiji has derived the Atman. That which is happy has borrowed its happiness, that which has knowledge has received its knowledge, and that which has relative existence has only a reflected existence. Wherever there are qualities, these qualities have been reflected upon the substance, but the soul has not knowledge, existence and blessedness as the qualities, they are the essence of the soul. Qualities acquired and lost, reflected, but these are the essence of the soul. Again it may be asked, why shall we take this for granted? Because Swamiji has just made a statement, not argued with. Why shall we admit that the soul has knowledge, blessedness, existence as its essence and has not borrowed them? It may be argued, why not say that the soul's luminosity, the soul's blessedness, the soul's knowledge are borrowed in the same way as the luminosity of the body is borrowed from the mind? The fallacy of arguing in this way will be that there will be no limit. That means there has to be something fixed, unchanging. If this has borrowed the light, that has borrowed the light, there will be no end. From whom were these borrowed? If we say from some other source, the same question will be asked again. So at last we shall have to come to one who is self-luminous. To make matters short then, the logical way is to stop where we get self-luminosity and proceed no further. Sa kashta, sa paragati. Self-luminosity is in Atman. We see then that the human being is composed first of this external covering, the body, secondly the finer body consisting of mind, intellect and egoism. Behind them is the real self of man. We have seen that all the qualities and powers of the gross body are borrowed from the mind, and the mind, the finer body, borrows the powers and luminosity from the soul standing behind. So that is standing behind. A great many questions now arise about the nature of this soul. Logically, Swamiji is trying to find out. If the existence of the soul is drawn from the argument that it is self-luminous, that knowledge, existence, blessedness are its essence, it naturally follows that the soul cannot have been created. If it is created, it will destroy. But it is permanent. A self-luminous existence independent of any other existence, could never have been the outcome of anything. It always existed. There was never a time when it did not exist, because if the soul did not exist, where was time? Time is only in the mind. So from one characteristics of the soul, that is self-luminous, everything can be derived. Time is in the soul. In the soul. It is when the soul reflects its power on the mind and the mind thinks that time comes. So it's expressed only in the mind. When there was no soul, certainly there was no thought, and without thought there was no time. How can the soul therefore be said to be existing in time when time itself exists in the soul? It has neither birth, next point. It has neither birth nor death, but it is passing through all these various stages. It is manifesting slowly and gradually from lower to higher and so on. It is expressing its own grandeur, working through the mind on the body, and through the body it is grasping the external world and understanding it. It takes up a body and uses it, and when that body has failed and is used up, it takes another body, and so on it goes. So we come across what is called a transmigratory self. But now analyze further. Here comes a very interesting question. That question which is generally known as the reincarnation of the soul. So if the body drops and soul does not drop, it gets another body. Now this is interesting because modern people do not believe it. It is interesting because so-called scientists cannot understand it. Sometimes people get frightened at the idea. In Mumbai, one church, perhaps Bandra church, had invited us. So I had gone to listen. And the Christian father with great gestures and postures were telling, do you want to become a mosquito? Do you want to become this? This is Hindu's theory. Hopeless. Now whether the question of you are wanting or you are being forced to become. So the dull head cannot understand that. And gesturing and posturing and talking in that influences other people who are equally dead. There is no chance of me to reply to that, but I was laughing inside. They get frightened. Sometimes people get frightened at the idea, and superstition is so strong that thinking men even believe that they are the outcome of nothing. And then with the grandest logic try to deduce the theory that although they have come out of zero, they will be eternal ever afterwards. Nobody can believe he will be finished. Those that come out of zero will certainly have to go back to zero. Neither you nor I nor anyone present has come out of zero, nor will go back to zero. In the Gita, Bhagavan tells Arjuna, there was no time when we were not there. There will be no time when we will not be there. We have been existing eternally and will exist, and there is no power under the sun or above the sun which can undo your or my existence or send us back to zero. Now this idea of reincarnation is not only not a frightening idea, but is most essential for the moral well-being of the human race. Unless we believe in this, we may do bad things. But we understand that whatever bad we do, we will have to repeat the fruit. Then only morality will come. It is the only logical conclusion that thoughtful men can arrive at. If you are going to exist in eternity hereafter, it must be that you have existed through eternity in the past. It cannot be otherwise. I will try to answer a few objections that are generally brought against the theory. Although many of you will think they are very silly objections, still you have to answer them, for sometimes we find that the most thoughtful men are ready to advance the silliest ideas. Well, has it been said that there never was an idea so absurd that it did not find philosophers to defend it? The first objection is, why do we not remember our past? Swamiji will answer few objections that are brought about the theory. Do we remember all our past in this life? So counter-argument. How many of you remember what you did when you were babies? None of you remember your early childhood. And if upon memory depends your existence, then this argument proves that you did not exist as babies. This we do not follow. Every logic has to be followed in all sides and conclusions. Because you do not remember your babyhood, it is simply unmitigated nonsense to say that our existence depends upon our remembering it. Why should we remember the past? That brain is gone, broken into pieces, and a new brain has been manufactured. What has come to this brain is the resultant, the sum total of the impressions acquired in our past, with which the mind has come to inhabit this new body. Okay. I, as I stand here, am the effect, the result of all the infinite past which is tacked on in me. And why is it necessary for me to remember all the past? When a great ancient sage, a seer, or a prophet of old, who came face to face with the truth, says sometimes something, these modern men stand up and say, oh, he was a fool. Superstition. But just use another name, Huxley says it, or Tyndall, then it must be true. And they take it for granted. In place of ancient superstitions, they have erected modern superstitions. In place of the old popes of religion, they have installed modern popes of science. Nobody checks. He says that is all right. So we say that this objection as to memory is not valid, and that is about the only serious objection that is raised against this theory. Now, another side. Although we have seen that it is not necessary for the theory that there shall be the memory of past life, yet at the same time, we are in a position to assert that there are instances which show that this memory does come, and that each one of us will get back this memory in that life in which he will become free. So just before the Nirvikal Samadhi, Jati Smaratva comes. We remember all our past lives, and then Parama Vairagya comes. Oh, we have been like that always. We don't want to be any more like that. Though it is not necessary, but the memory comes. Then alone you will find that this world is but a dream. Then alone you will realize in the soul of your soul that you are but actors and the world is a stage. We have come several times and different parts you have taken. Then alone will the idea of non-attachment come to you with the power of thunder. Then all this thirst for enjoyment, this clinging on to life and this world will vanish, because we have had this innumerable times, forever. Then the mind will see clearly as daylight how many times all this existed for you, how many millions of times you had fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, relatives and friends, wealth and power. They came and went. How many times you were on the topmost crest of the wave, And how many times you were down at the bottom of despair? When memory will bring all this to you, then alone will you stand as a hero and smile. When the world frowns upon you, then alone will you stand up and say, I care not for thee even. O death, what terrors hast thou for me? This will come to all. Are there any arguments, any rational proofs for this reincarnation of the soul? So far we have been giving the negative side, showing that the opposite arguments to disprove it are not valid. Are there any positive proofs? There are, and most valid ones too. No other theory except that of reincarnation accounts for the wide divergence that we find between man and man in their powers to acquire knowledge. First, let us consider the process by means of which knowledge is acquired. Suppose I go into the street and see a dog. How do I know it is a dog? I refer it to my mind. In my mind are groups of all my past experiences, arranged and pigeonholed as it were. As soon as a new impression comes, I take it up and refer it to some of the old pigeonholes, and as soon as I find a group of the same impressions already existing, I place it in that group and I am satisfied. That is knowledge. When we find a group, we find it is with knowledge. I know it is a dog because it coincides with impressions already there. When I do not find the cognate of this new experience inside, I become dissatisfied. Chitta Vishranti Rahitya, according to Jivan Mukti Vivek. When not finding the cognates of an impression, we become dissatisfied. This state of the mind is called ignorance. But when finding the cognates of an impression already existing, we become satisfied. This is called knowledge. When one apple fell, men became dissatisfied. Then gradually they found out the group. What was the group they found? That all apples fell. So they called it gravitation. Now we see that without a fund of already existing experience, any new experience would be impossible. If there is no previous experience, with what we will care? Compare. So no experience will be there. Experience means after comparing we give it a name and then only it is called experience. For there would be nothing to which to refer the new impression. So if, as some of the European philosophers think, a child came into the world with what they call tabula rasa, clean state, such a child would never attain to any degree of intellectual power, because he would have nothing to which to refer his new experiences. We see that the power of acquiring knowledge varies in each individual, and this shows that each one of us has come with his own fund of knowledge. Knowledge can only be got in one way, the way of experience. There is no other way to know. If we have not experienced it in this life, we must have experienced it in other lives. How is it that the fear of death is everywhere? A little chicken is just out of an egg, and an eagle comes, and the chicken flies in fear of to its mother. There is an old explanation, I should hardly dignify it by such a name. It is called instinct. Beautiful analysis Swamiji will make now. Instinctively we know. Swamiji will show instinct is nothing but repeated rationality. What makes that little chicken just out of the egg afraid to die? How is it that as soon as a duckling hatched by a hen comes near water, it jumps into it and swims? It never swam before, nor saw anything swim. People call it instinct. It is a big word, but it lives nowhere, but it leaves us where we were before. Let us study this phenomena of instinct. Doctors especially, those who know, some people, doctors will say, intuitively found it. My friend, a sadhaka doctor, used to say, it is developed instinct that we know this. A child begins to play on the piano. At first, she must pay attention to every key she is fingering, and as she goes on and on for months and years, the playing becomes almost involuntary, instinctive. What was first done with conscious will does not require later on an effort of the will. This is not yet a complete proof. One half remains, and that is that almost all the actions which are now instinctive can be brought under the control of the will. So instinct is repeated use of the will has become instinct. And if instinct can be controlled under the will, it means it can again be brought into will. Each muscle of the body can be brought under control. This is perfectly well known. One of my friends could easily move his ear. Cows move, man does not require to move, so he dropped that. It is called atavism. But if he makes an effort, he can make it move. So the proof is complete by this double method that what we now call instinct is degeneration of voluntary actions. Therefore, if the analogy applies to the whole of creation, if all nature is uniform, that we always take for granted, then only laws are formed. Then what is instinct in lower animals as well as in men must be the degeneration of will. Applying the law we dwelt upon under macrocosm, that each involution presupposes an evolution, and each evolution an involution, we see that instinct is involved reason. Reason becomes involved as instinct, instinct becomes expressed as reason. What we call instinct in men or animals must therefore be involved, degenerated, voluntary actions. And voluntary actions are impossible without experience. Experience started that knowledge, and the knowledge is there. The fear of death, the duckling sticking to the water, and all involuntary actions in the human being which have become instinctive are the result of past experiences. So far we have proceeded very clearly, and so far the latest science is with us. But here comes one more difficulty. The latest scientific men are coming back to the ancient sages, and as far as they have done so, there is perfect agreement. They admit that each man and each animal is born with a fund of experience, and that all their actions in the mind are the result of past experience. But what they ask is the use of saying that experience belongs to the soul. Why not say it belongs to the body and the body alone? Why not say it is hereditary transmission? So again the instinct theory, another theory is brought, hereditary transmission. So that's how you will reply now. This is the last question. Why not say that all the experience with which I am born is the resultant effect of all the past experience of my ancestor? This is genes. The sum total of the experience from the little protoplasm up to the highest human being is in me, but it has come from body to body in the course of hereditary transmission. Oh, will not be able to complete today, huh? Where will the difficulty be? This question is very nice, and we admit some part of this hereditary transmission. What part? How far? As far as furnishing the material, we by our past actions conform ourselves to a certain birth in a certain body, conform. And the only suitable material for that body comes from the parents who have made themselves fit to have that soul as their offspring. So the universal intelligence works and sends us to those parents. That much heredity. The simple hereditary theory takes for granted the most astonishing proposition without any proof that mental experience can be recorded in matter, that mental experience can be involved in matter. We will take it up on the next one. Little concluding portion is there. We cannot finish it off today. So next one, what we shall do, complete it and go to the next chapter. So today, Swamiji is telling that there is a soul. And the soul reincarnates. And against reincarnation, memory was brought, that Swamiji has replied. And then experience, we are born with some experience. And that experience has come from our past life. Against this, the arguments of physical sciences are being examined, and Swamiji is replying one by one. Let me quote a small incident here. Sri Ramakrishna's disciples, Akhandan Swami and Turiyan Swami, some people objected why they are behaving like old people. They are very young. Sri Ramakrishna replied, you are seeing their young age in this present life. How do you know how many lives they have finished already? So, we are the result of our past life, and if we gain the knowledge that we are just the reflection, our reality is the eternal Satchidananda, we become free. And before becoming free, we will get the memory of all our past lives, and through Parama Vairagya we will go into freedom. Om Paratatve Sada Lino Ramakrishna Samagyaya Yo Dharma Sthapana Rato Vire Shamtam Namamyam. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hare Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.